Good evening, everyone. Welcome to xLights GEM's presentation on an introduction to xLights, controllers, and setups. That'll be given tonight by Ron Armstrong. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Ron. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this introductory series. This particular edition, we're going to talk about the controller tab, as Andy indicated, and different types of controllers and kind of some recommended configurations for controllers and xLights just to make your life easier and take advantage of the new improvements that have been made in xLights over the last year or more. Previously, you had worked on layout and set up models and stuff. Daryl gave the earlier classes, so I've got a different layout than what you guys may have seen in the earlier classes if you're following along, but still we just got a generic layout here with a bunch of models. We'll work on that a little bit as well. I do want to, I got kind of some notes here I'm going to flip back and forth to follow along with. So there's two primary types of controllers that you're going to add into xLights. Either an Ethernet controller or an add USB, which would be technically a serial type controller. Most of the time you're going to deal with add an Ethernet controller. So we can add manually. We're going to show you how to add a controller manually and some of the settings, but then we're going to also come back and focus on how can I discover where my controllers are, because there's been a tremendous amount of improvements in the discovery of discovering your controller. So initially, if you can add an Ethernet, now Ethernet is going to be any kind of network attached controller where you plug into your network, get an IP address, that kind of thing. So if you're going to add manually, you can see on the right-hand side, we got a set of properties, and what we're going to be discussing a lot today is the different properties for different controller types that you may want to select. If you're doing it manual add, you kind of got to know a lot of these details, right? What my vendor of the controller, maybe I've got like a Falcon, what model that controller is. And then once I select a controller vendor and model, I get a series of additional properties. And I'm like, this could look very confusing to you, right? What do I want this auto layout models? Do I want these settings? So this is why we're kind of not currently recommending just manually adding them unless you really know the settings you want to have. Right? So it can add a lot of confusion, which is why we're having this class. So we're going to try to simplify things and make life easier. Um, the developers of xLights are always looking at ways of bringing new features and functionality, and one of the primary goals is to just make things easier for people to configure their shows and not have to know as many of the back-end technical details. So in that vein, there's been a lot of improvement to the discovery. You may have heard people in the past sometimes say, don't use the discovery because it might add some things you don't want to add. That has that's no longer the case, right? So discovery's been improved substantially. I'm going to go ahead and choose discovery. Now, in my setup here is going to be atypical. I'm going to have lots of different controllers and different controller types that I currently have connected to my network. So once you get your controller plugged in, connected to your network, you could then, as long as it's plugged into the network that your xLights computer can reach and talk to, it should be able to discover controller devices. And it uses several different methods on how to discover. And one of which, because some controllers can discover neighbors, and tell me other controllers that that controller can see. So once it discovers the first controller, it will use that controller to try to discover others, just to make sure it has a full, complete set. When you discover controllers, it's going to predefine some of these settings over here we talked about earlier. So I'm just going to go through several different of the controller types that you'll see in here. Right now we're looking at a Falcon F48. So I deleted the Falcon earlier that automatically discovered both the vendor and the model and the priorities that and the properties here that we recommend as the standard. I would advise, even after discovery, to review these settings to make sure that they're accurate. I'm going to highlight example. This particular controller here is one of my first year 2022 Genius controllers. The Genius controller, early Genius controllers do not automatically identify the vendor and the ID with the discovery. So even though it identified it as an available controller, I may still have to come in here and populate the experience lights is what I need here and populate what it is. I do not have connected right now, but I've got some of the later model Genius 16s and they discover and it populates fine with the newer firmwares and the newer controller models. The older controller model just did not auto-populate. So just even though it discovered it, you may still want to double check, make sure your vendor and model are correct. You may recognize I see a bunch of different FPP devices in here. At my network, I've got a lot of FPP. When discovering FPP, if they're like Raspberry Pis without a cape defined, then it's going to discover it and just add it as a player only. It works very hard to try to determine how is the FPP configured so it can populate it correctly. I do happen to have an FPP here that is actually configured as a virtual matrix. So it was the discovery was able to recognize that and properly configure it as an FPP matrix model type. So when it discovers, just be aware that review these vendor and model settings because that's going to be critical for using the tools like Visualizer. I'm going to highlight a little bit about IP addresses as we get down into here. So the discovery now in the modern versions of xLights, all of the things we're discussing today are on modern versions of xLights. As of this recording, I'm currently running on this system 2025.03. And it now will attempt, if your computer is able to communicate and resolve your IP addresses to a name, it will try to use that name. In your environment, for like Falcons and Geniuses, may not actually resolve by name, and you might see IPs. So some of these controllers that have an IP only were ones that my computer cannot resolve by name. So again, as a best practice, one of the things that has been recommended lately and a lot of improvements in xLights is actually communicating to controllers by name and leveraging DNS or a multicast name resolution in order to use names to help, make it less confusing on IP addresses. Because not everybody's a networking expert, right? These controllers with IP addresses down here, there's an IP address and they're kind of basic. These happen to be WLED devices, I know. So I can choose one of these controllers, hit open, and you can see that this is one of my WLED devices. When Discovery goes out and discovers things that it knows about, WLED does not return back in that discovery request with a lot of information, which is why it can't automatically populate it. So again, if it's not populated with a vendor and name, make sure and choose your appropriate vendor and name. All of these controllers that we discovered here are network-based controllers or Ethernet-based controllers. We didn't really talk about serial controllers yet, but we're going to shortly. Adding a USB serial controller, well, they will not be discovered. So you would have to manually add them. If you are using that USB serial controller connected directly to this xLights computer, that is the only time that you would use a serial-based type controller. So if I had a Lightorama controller as an example, using the Lightorama dongle plugged into this computer, I would just come in and configure that as a Lightorama. I'd choose the vendor as a Lightorama. What is my particular model? Maybe a CTV16. One thing about a serial controller device, sometimes these properties, when I choose the vendor and model, they do not automatically change. If I select a different controller and come back, now these properties have updated for that controller selection type. That's been communicated. They just have to capture that detail, and I'm sure that will be fixed in future revisions. But as you select from one vendor and model on a serial controller type, these settings may or may not automatically change. Super easy, just select a different controller or select in the white space to deselect it, select the controller again, and then it'll populate. So on a Lightorama, you may use the Lightorama protocol, and you would have to configure the appropriate speed for the Lightorama pigtail that you have, whether it's a high speed or low speed. Using serial-based controllers in the controller tab here is probably going to be a very small, minute set of shows that would require that. Um, when doing other network pixel-based controllers with Lightorama or other DMX devices, normally they'll be attached to another controller, and we'll talk about that when we break out into the controller specifics. Kind of enough on the initial part of that, kind of went through a vendor model and also this computer that I'm on right now, just due to its network location, was unable to discover my Advatech, which is connected to my show network. Um, and yeah, I was just going to talk about that briefly because it's on a separate show network anyway. So what are the right settings for my particular controller? You'll notice I have some Falcons in here, some experienced lights. I got some Culps. If I were to overgeneralize controller functionality, I'm going to put controllers into two primary classes. Either you're a controller type that we would refer to as an active controller, which means by design that controller, by design and configuration, that controller is expected to receive the show data over the network live, either with like the E131 or the DDP protocol. The other high level category I would call is a multi-sync controller. Multi-sync controllers, you would copy the sequence to each controller themselves, and each controller would play his own version of the sequence and only receive the sync packets from the primary player. By and far, the most popular multi-sync controller type would be an FPP-driven controller, whether it's FPP on a Raspberry Pi or like a xLights, a Wally's controller, a Scott Hansen controller type. Those all are driven by FPP. So FPP, many controllers can be figured by either type. In general, at default, FPP, we normally use them as multi-sync. The settings we discuss are going to be different for multi-sync than active. So again, active controllers or controllers that you have to send the live show data to over the network, and multi-sync controllers get a copy of the sequence and they play their own copy and just get a sync packet from the player. So this is talking about multi-sync initially, right? So multi-sync, you have a player mode and a remote mode. Your player mode would be if you choose to use that controller as your player, and the remote mode is just going to sit there and wait for the player to send him packets to say, start this sequence, stop this sequence, move to the next sequence. In xLights today, the configuration on the right is going to be the same whether you're in player mode or remote mode. So we'll just start with like this xLights K8, right? So vendor and model is critical. By default, normally you want all of the check marks enabled here. So auto layout models is what gives Visualizer the capabilities to auto assign models and create the channels and what channel addresses each model should have. So we always recommend auto layout models to make sure you're enabled if you want to use a visualizer and the auto addressing processes. Auto upload configuration for FPP based, these settings may not show up on every controller type. So auto upload configuration means that every time that you enable outputs in xLights, like turn on the light bulb for output to lights, then it would actually upload the configuration to the controller that's defined in the visualizer. So every time you turn on output to lights, it uploads to the controller. When you turn it off, that's fine. So there used to be some time back a specific scenario where that auto upload configuration may set a setting on your controller that is not the setting that you want to have, and it would not set it back. So it was frequently communicated to make sure auto upload configuration is unchecked so that you wouldn't run into that particular issue. However, that's long been solved, and um, it, so whether you want to auto upload the configuration every time you output to lights and xLights or not is just a personal choice. So leave it on, it's fine. If you choose to take it off, that's fine too. By default, it will always be enabled by default. There is no more of an issue with leaving that on in modern versions of xLights. If you're still running an old version xLights, then you may encounter that problem. So if you do, just turn it off. Auto size is what allows xLights to be able to automatically adjust the number of channels associated with your controller based upon the models that you add in Visualizer. So auto layout models and auto size work in conjunction with each other in order to allow the Visualizer to do its magic of automatic addressing. So always leave those on. Full xLights control. When you see that, not all controller types have that option. By full xLights control, what you're saying is I am choosing to allow xLights to fully control the settings on my controller based upon what's configurable in xLights. So the new methodology that we've been using for several years now is that allow xLights to be like the master source of truth and always just configure the controllers from xLights. So once you're defining them in xLights, done. Upload to the controller, controller's configured. You're going to prevent a tremendous number of configuration mistakes by allowing these check marks to stay lit. When the discovery occurred, every controller gets added with a default port brightness of 100. Not all controllers support this setting, but if the setting is here, just observe that and set your own preferred brightness that you prefer to run your show at, right? Rarely do we see people choose to run default brightness at 100. 30 seems to be a super common brightness to run shows at. 20, 30, 40, whatever you set. That's going to be based upon your specific area, the amount of ambient light, and how you think your show looks with those properties. If you're just starting out brand new, we typically recommend setting it for 30. And when you start setting up your show and you're running it, then then once you're setting up your show and you're running it, go outside and say, I want that to be a little brighter. I want that to be a little darker. I want that, you can come in and adjust it. When adjusting a lot of these settings, you would have to just upload output to the controller, and then that will configure the controller with the setting. Active setting, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that's very key. For multi-sync controllers that you expect to use the multi-sync protocol and allow the controller to just get sync packets, we always want those set to xLights only. So that's commonly all the Culps, all the EPP controllers. Falcon and Genius controllers can run in a mode where there are a remote, and therefore they would be xLights only if you choose to configure and use them as a multi-sync controller type by enabling the remote mode, then that would need to be set as xLights only. So their choices are active, inactive, and xLights only. Multi-sync controller types, xLights only. Active controller types that your controller expects to receive the data over the network. It's like your Falcons, Hanks Picks, Genius, Alpha Picks, Baldric, a whole series of different controller types that would be active. That'd be a controller that expects to actively receive network. If you have a multi-sync controller in remote mode and you're running it remote where you're uploading sequences and allowing sequences to play, and you also configure it inactive, you may be causing a configuration mistake that's going to cause you headache. So with active, your player computer, your player device, I'm just going to assume we're doing FPP for a player, whether it's FPP or X schedule. Your player device would be configured to actively send data over the network. And if he's playing its own local copy of the sequence plus also getting data over the network, that's going to be a configuration mistake. So make sure if you're a multi-sync controller type like Falcons, or excuse me, like Colps, FPP, things like ES Pixel Stick with an SD card. Basically, if your controller takes an SD card and you upload sequences to it, that would be multi-sync. Configure him as xLights only. Um, if you're a multi-sync controller, the protocol of choice here, E131 or DDP, is irrelevant because that protocol will only be used for an active controller type. A COLP controller can operate as an active controller type and actively receive data over the network. That's just a very uncommon configuration. If your controller, so let's talk about actives for a little bit. Falcon, do I have anything that's configured as E131 by default? I do have a couple controllers configured as E131, but evidently they're not currently online on this network config I got going. So an Falcon normally would be used as an active controller. So his active setting is going to have to be active. A lot of the same configurations here, auto layout, auto size, full xLights control. Does not have an auto upload configuration option we talked about earlier because it just doesn't support that feature. Um, if you're running him as an active controller where he actively would be, your player will be sending active data to it, make sure he's active. And then the protocol is going to be what is used, E130 or DDP. It's commonly recommended to use DDP as long as your controller type specific does support DDP. Most modern controllers support DDP. Some controllers will only support E131. It is perfectly acceptable to have a mix of both E131 controllers and DDP controllers in the same show. Perfectly acceptable. Not actually watching chat, but certainly if any chat, it'd be up here at the top. If any messages come up in chat, just feel free to stop me and answer questions. Though I know we're going through this kind of fast. Um, what are some of the other interesting controller types here? The what I did point to controller attributes, we talked about making sure your vendor model selected, your auto layout settings, E131 versus DDP. Hinks Pix was not discovered on this setup, which I'm fine with, but I was going to talk about WLED and ES Pixel Stick. Today, with the current versions of xLights, and this will change shortly, probably in the next release. Once you've discovered a WLED device, you'll notice, so WLED will always be an active controller type. WLED is always an active controller type. So he can't detect what his vendor is because of the discovery information that comes back upon discovery. So just figure out if he's um, a dig to go, a dig Uno, a WLED. Some of the other devices might be like an RGB to go. I actually have an RGB to go on here. Um, I think this is the one. Apologize. I don't want that one. I want user interface. Nope, that's not the one. Or 130 is him. I'm going to go ahead and configure him properly. So the 4130 is an RGB to go. So there are several different controllers that do run WLED software, right? RGB to go. We have just native WLED. And we'll probably do a whole segment on WLED at one point in here. Like the Quinn LED based controllers, the Dig Quad, Dig Uno, Dig Octas are highly popular. Haven't seen much on the CSP32 do for a while, but Wasatch Pixels has a series of WLED based controllers as well as RGB. So just make sure you select your correct vendor and then the correct model. This particular one happens to be a Tetra to go. And that helps define the type of outputs that are available. But also when choosing a WLED based controller, it's always going to be DDP protocol. However, this keep channel numbers with WLED controllers needs to be unchecked. Today, since this was discovered via discovery, this was checked because it doesn't know what it is, because it doesn't return a lot of information. So we do want to make sure that with DDP and WLED controllers, that remains unchecked. If I manually added a WLED controller, and I'm just going to choose like a Dig Uno as an example, and then I choose the DDP protocol, it's automatically not checked. But because it doesn't recognize the specific vendor information, the discovery might leave that checked. So just make sure if you're using WLED that this keep channel numbers is unchecked. That's a requirement. Two different operation modes for the DDP protocol, and this helps define that mode. But all I really want to talk about WLED there. Nope, this needs to go away. Apologize. Oh, and ES Pixel Stick is similarly where ES Pixel Stick, this is an ES Pixel Stick device that I have up and running, and it did discover it properly. And when using DDP with ES Pixel Stick, also that keep channel numbers needs to be unchecked. So DDP protocol needs to be unchecked for Pixel Stick and WLED, and yes checked for other DDP type controllers that are most common. If you have an uncommon controller, you might need to check with your vendor if it's DDP 1 based, or which would be unchecked, or DDP raw, which would be checked. But in the common ones that we see here, Pixel Stick and WLED are unchecked. We talked a little bit about AC controllers and DMX. So the most common way when intermixing and having DMX devices and like Lightorama AC controllers is not to use a serial controller type here, because you're probably going to want to attach those to one of your other show controllers, like a Falcon or a Genius or any other controller that has a DMX output. So if you're adding like AC controllers that operate off of DMX, let's just say, because it's at the top of my list here, a Falcon. When I go to my Falcon visualizer, these are the ports available for this F48. When a controller has DMX outputs on it, you will have a serial port configuration. So your DMX devices would be attached to like a Falcon into the serial port and visualizer, not a separate controller. So even though your Lightorama AC controller in xLights, you don't define it as a separate controller, you just associate it with your with the controller that it's attached to. So this is my Genius 16. It has two DMX outputs, serial port 1, serial port 2. That'd be DMX 1, DMX port 2. So if I had some AC models, then they would just be associated here in Visualizer. I just want to say what I'm going on here real quick. Okay, bring up my notes again. No notes. And we're going to get into kind of like the visualizer and assigning models and stuff too. So if you attended the earlier classes, you'll know that Daryl did a great job of setting up the models. And one thing we didn't talk about are controller connections and stuff for models and how to address them, right? So the initial part is you don't care about addressing. You may not even have controllers yet. You may not even have anything available. So just go ahead and like Daryl had indicated, go ahead and set up all your models. And you'll notice your start channels and everything here are just arbitrary start channels. Um, these are all based upon the order in which you added them to the layout. Right. So now we're going to go in and configure those. So you may have noticed, I know he skipped over in the other classes, like a controller option here and controller connection setting that normally defaults to port 0 and all that. You would not normally make any changes on the layout tab for your controllers. That is what the visualizer is for. So I'm going to take this bulb archie just as an example and probably this tree also. And you can see that they're currently assigned to no controller, and the controller connections is pretty blank and not much here. So if I go, my Falcon is an example, and that was a Boscoyo bulby arch in Visualizer on my controller selection. Once it's configured, I would just hit the visualize button. And this is it's your virtualized connectivity diagram. What models are plugged into what port? So you have a list of all your models on the right that are in your layout, and then you would have the port configuration for this specific controller. And what you see here is dependent upon the specific controller. Like this RGB to go earlier, this is a Tetra to go, which only has 4 ports available and no serial ports. So what you see here is very dependent upon your specific controller. K8 scroller might have 8 local ports and a few differential receiver ports, or in this case, the scroller only has 1 and a couple of serial ports. Um, if you have an FPP player, it won't be able to visualize. If you can't visualize, just double check your vendor and model in your controller type. Like this one here is a Matos Dragon controller that is also based on the Genius Experience Lights 2022 era configuration, and it did not auto detect vendor and model. But if I choose my vendor and model, it will visualize just fine. So if you can't visualize, just make sure you have the right model selected. See some items in chat here real quick. They're likely a sequence for the is there a rule of thumb on how many pixels per port, 12 volt? Looks like those are getting answered in there. Helpers, if you just want to call out to me if anybody has any specific chats. I saw some popping up there, but
You're good.
um, so let's go back to my Falcon and grab this bulby arch. So the process of adding it, so here's my bulby arch. So I just drag it over and I put it on whatever port that's going to attach to. Say port 1. So I'm going to plug this bulby arch into port 1. And that assigned all of the addresses. When you hover over a model, you get this little tooltip pop up and it'll automatically show you your start channels, end channels, and some of these details. So it will automatically address the models based upon the order in which you place them. The addresses are going to be all consecutive from the top of this page, just like you read, left to right, top to bottom. So if I had maybe this bed window was attached to that also, I'd drag it at the end. And then if I had maybe some candy canes on say port 2, and this candy cane on say port 3, then when I look at the start channels, this first one is start channel 1, look in parentheses, and ends at 1971. Then the bed window starts at 1972, ends at, sorry, the little tooltip pop back up. And I'm on my Mac here real quick. Sometimes the tooltips you have to select and reselect in order for them to pop up. The tooltips are not always consistent on a Mac. But we'll look at the addresses over in the layout tab. So we've got a few items assigned here real quick. Now let's go to my next controller. I don't know, let's just pick this Matos one, right? And let's assign my tree. So this is going to be my tree controller. So come down here. These are normally reasonably alphabetized. So grab the tree, drag the tree over, and this is not the controller I want to do that with. So because it happens to have 24 ports, tree. I need a smaller one. K8. I had to switch computers to do this demonstration because my other computer was not behaving today. Um, so some of the prep work I had ready is not there, so I apologize about fumbling around. So I added the tree onto my controller, but one thing I noticed is like, wait a minute, why do I have these tree on all of these ports? Well, this particular Culp K8 only has 20 available ports, but my tree is configured as 24 ports. And you'll notice down here at the bottom, you'll have errors. When you're working in Visualizer, please pay attention to this bottom part of the screen. If you have warnings or errors, those are items that need to be addressed. So, um, the Visualizer works off of a series of predefined rules, and the specifics of those rules are dependent upon the capabilities of the controller as you have configured. So when you're using the visualizer to assign controller models, just note the down here at the bottom, be aware of any warnings and error messages and make sure and address them. Here it's telling me that, oh, these ports are not valid because I don't have those that number of ports on here. But my tree is not really a 24 port tree. Why is it a 24 port tree? Well, when you configure a model, you can configure them depending on the model type. Most models are defined to fit on one controller port, but you might need to split them onto multiple controller ports. We call that strings. And xLights string equals a controller port. And the tree model, by default, when you just add a new tree, the default for a new tree is going to be 16 strings with 50 pixels, which strings equals controller ports in the xLights world. So this is saying 16 controller ports. That's probably not what you want. So this tree on my right-hand side, it's 24 strands. So it goes up and down 24 times, 100 up, 100 down, 100 up, 100 down. It's configured for 8 controller ports. So 8 controller ports and there's 24 total. That means it goes up and down 3 times. So it's up, then again, up, and repeating up, down, up. So the controller ports, if I my hover tooltip, please behave, Mr. Mac. It started to, but then anyway. When you hover over a model, traditionally, if your hover over tooltips are functional, it'll show you the total number of nodes. So this tree is total of 2,400 nodes across 8 ports. I wanted to flip over the layout to show you the strings, the nodes per string, which would be the number of lights per controller port. And then the strands per string would be the number of up and downs. In the visualizer, as long as your pixels are evenly distributed across ports, I can just go to the visualizer, right click on this model, and there's an option to change string count. So wait a minute, my tree's 24. I know I built it so that it's 8 strings, which remember in xLights, strings equals controller ports. And say, okay, now I just reconfigured that to be 8 controller ports, and there's 300 per port. If I go ahead and close Visualizer, I'm saving. Every time you make a change, your save button turns red. Make sure you hit save. I go back and look at that tree. What did that do when I made the change in Visualizer? What that did was, y'all notice when I put it in Visualizer, I now have my controller selected, the KAB. When I made the string change, you'll notice it changed these numbers for me. The number of strings, changed that automatically. The nodes per string, automatically changed that to 300. Then the strands per string, which is the number of zigzags. You notice the tooltips. This is typically how many times zigzag. Up, is 3. Up, down, up, repeating. Once a model is assigned to a controller, you'll notice in your start channels up here at the top will change. So this tree instead of being just a standard number, which is an absolute address, now references the controller. In this case, exclamation point KB1 is the controller name. And then the parentheses is the xLights channel number that got automatically assigned to that guy. So he starts at 2554 and ends at 9753. It did that all automatically. We don't have to worry about universes addressing what address. By leveraging the visualizer and the auto layout opportunities, it will automatically handle all your addresses according to those predefined standard rules. If your configuration doesn't match those predefined standard rules, then there are other options to take forward to. There'd be a more advanced option. Feel free to come back in the Zoom room and ask somebody if you needed some help. But either the options are either like to do manual addressing method like we've done in years past, many years ago, or potentially leverage a concept called shadow models. But if your configuration matches your standard rules for your controller, then easy peasy, done deal. You'll notice down here, now that this is assigned to a controller, I'll pick my star as an example, it's not yet assigned. The controller connection settings on a model. So a model has these properties down here that were kind of briefly discussed earlier. And the controller connection settings would be settings that you could apply to your controller. But obviously, if the model is not yet assigned to a controller, there's no settings. So let's pick my tree, controller connection settings. Now I have quite a bit more controller connection options, right? My tree was plugged into port 1 on this K8. What is the default protocol without changing anything? The default protocol is going to populate as 2811. This particular controller type supports start nulls, end nulls, brightness, gamma setting, color order, pixel direction, and zigzag. So these options that are available are going to be controller dependent. So if I wanted this tree to be a different brightness as an example, except it unselected for some reason because it's the Mac. Once I select brightness, then I can say, I really only want my tree at 20% brightness. This settings in this controller connection will not take any effect until you upload the configuration to the controller. I'm going to save real quick and I'm going to upload output. Remember the default was at 30. I set the tree to 20. Upload complete. If I open that controller, and it did a app restart. When I do an upload output of configuration, it does an app restart. There's no real error here. I just opened it before app fully restarted. It started to say the app daemon wasn't running, in case you're observant. And if I go to that output page, you'll see anything that has my tree on it is defined at 20%. Anything that is not yet defined is the default setting of 30. If I change the default setting in upload outputs, it will change everything that's not explicitly defined. But if it's explicitly defined, it will stay there until you change it. So if I really want my tree, go back to layout, the tree model, back down to brightness. I really want this guy to be 40%. So by setting him to 40, nothing has changed until I upload output. So if I upload output, again, it says upload complete. Go back to this web page and refresh. You can see that the tree is now set at 40%. Nice. So by leveraging xLights to do all your configuration for you, it just upload output automatically configures your controller. Candy canes and such, right? So I can see like this candy cane I'd put on port 2, that was automatically assigned via the visualizer. This candy cane I'd put on port 3. Everything as far as the controller configuration on the models is all handled by the visualizer. A lot of people typically ask what is like the best controller, right? So the best controller is the one that you understand and know how to use. Um, One thing that we didn't cover yet, yeah, let me jump into that, starting locations. So when working in your layout and laying out lines and stuff, right? This is an extra tree I just added. I'm just going to delete that tree. I don't need him. Daryl did talk about green square, blue square. When you're drawing your lines, you always want to make sure your square you're starting on your lines and ending on your lines are always the same direction. Typically, we prefer green on the left and on the bottom, which means you draw from left to right or you draw from the bottom up. So all my verticals here should be green at the bottom. My garage will be a good example of this. So when I add a model, there is a concept of starting location. Most models by default, the starting location is set to green square. So we need to make sure and define in a model where is the starting point, right? Where does the controller connect? Um, and that would be denoted by when you look at a model, you'll have the teal pixel would be your pixel number one, effectively. And you'll see teal pixel up here. It's kind of hard to see on the screen in my view, but actually that one's on the right because he's configured that way. Let me scroll back over here. This model, so the starting location is where your controller connects. If you drew everything appropriately, you notice on the right-hand side, greens at the bottom, greens at the bottom, greens at the bottom. This garage was set up so that controller connects on the left. It goes up, then connects on the right, on the top. So green square, following the data flow. You're going to flow to the end, and then it connects at the top up here, which technically would be blue square. In this layout, I have my models locked. So the blue squares turn red when locked. So I'm just going to unlock this so you can just kind of see that it's actually technically a blue square. By default, when drawing that, the configuration would be green square and it'd have first pixel down here at the bottom, the teal. That's not really what it is. It connects to this horizontal at the top. So you may need to come in and make sure that you define the starting location. Where is pixel number one? This would be the controller facing connection. In this case, set it to the blue square. And now you'll notice that first pixel is at the top. So the data flow for this garage starts at the left, goes up horizontally across the top, and then flows down this way. So you do want to make sure that you specify the starting location for where that model connects to the controller. Basically the input side. This is the input side. Lot of detail real quick. We didn't get into technical, individual speeds and feeds on which controller, what's the better controller for you here or there. The answer is yes. All modern controllers, Falcons, Geniuses, Culp controllers, Baldric controllers, they're all great controllers and do many things. Many people pick a controller type, brand, or model, and that's what they always go with because that's what they're familiar with, which is perfectly fine. It's also perfectly fine to intermix them if you need to. All of the shows that I manage have multiple controllers from different manufacturers. It's the right tool for the job. Um, if you do have further questions about your specific configuration or controller, we will have a Q&A session at the end of this meeting, as well as the Zoom room is here available pretty much 24/7 for free help. Obviously, plenty of Facebook groups as well that you can ask those questions, and there's plenty of volunteer helpers that would be more than happy to address your specific controller configuration. I'll go ahead and open up for Q&A or any helpers if there's anything specific that we didn't go over that we'd like to go over. Um, don't really feel we need to beat the dead horse, but any other questions or QA? I'm not seeing anything immediately. Bunch of stuff in chat here real quick. I think most of those have been addressed. Helpers, any outstanding questions in chat?
Nope.
Nope.
Perfect, perfect. I appreciate
Nobody
your
has
time
any
and patience.
questions?
I know I'm losing my voice. Work has been hectic this week, and I apologize for that, but been talking a lot this week. Yeah. Feel free to stick around after the meeting ends, and we'll be happy to address your questions directly if need be. So appreciate your time and happy lighting.
Thank you again, Ron. With that, I'm going to stop the recording and end the session. You can find these all on the YouTube channel, xLights Gems. We keep all the recordings of all the Wednesday night sessions there. Thank you all. Good night.